Okay, so I don't need to tell you, my name's Ginda Simpson. I had the privilege to live in Egypt for 6 years. 30, now almost 30 years ago, but Egypt changes slowly, so a lot of my information will probably still be very much up to date.
That in itself is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, there's a joke that, when Moses parted the Red Sea, and he turned around and said to the rest of the Egyptians, "I'll be back, don't change a thing." So it changes slowly, but in some areas very rapidly.
So what year were you there?
I was there from 93 to 99. Okay. And what took us there was my husband's job. He's a geologist, worked as a geologist as a petroleum geologist. And I got a call one afternoon from the office, and he seldom called me from work, and said, "How would you like to live in Egypt for a year?" And my response was, "Can I have till dinner to let you know?" A few hours later, he came home, and I said, "Absolutely, yes." Even though we had 3 teenage daughters that were going to be on this adventure. And it was a 1-year assignment. So most of our friends thought we were just plain crazy to do that. But I knew how important it was to their education, mostly my children, but me as well. So I'm going to show you, okay, wait a minute, bear with me.
Can I just ask you what your first name is so unusual?
Ginda. My name is Virginia. I never felt like a Virginia. I had a little brother who couldn't say it. He called me Ginda. It's one of the names that stuck. I have 5 brothers. It was one of the nicer names. So I'm sticking with Ginda. So that's where it comes from.
And you spell it with an A and not an E.
G-I-N, like Linda, but with a G. Yeah.
Okay.
G-I-N-D-A.
Okay.
Okay, so Ginda was kind enough to provide a map, which I hadn't thought to do, which will be helpful. We live in Cairo, but during that 1 year that turned into 6, we literally traveled all over the country. Upper Egypt, which is south of the Nile, down in this area here, all the way down to close to, I'm not good at this. That's it. It goes all the way down to the Sudanese border, to Lake Nasser, over a little bit in the Western Desert, which is up here, to Siwa Oasis, over into the Sinai. And this little spot right there is where our daughter lives to this day. Now, I want to tell you that... No, Dahab, which is about an hour from Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a resort town. I do need to say that this daughter came kicking and screaming. She's a senior in high school, had no desire whatsoever to live in this godforsaken country. Could we leave her back behind and she would live with a friend? And we said, absolutely not. You'll have to trust me. I know this will enrich your life forever. You're coming. She's been there ever since.
Does she marry a local man?
Her husband is half Egyptian, half Scottish. So it is interesting. So I decided the best way to talk about Egypt is through my paintings, because when I started my year in Egypt, it was with the intention of just painting everything I saw. And as the stay turned into from 1 year to 2 years, I realized I couldn't say enough with my paintings. I needed to start writing about what I was seeing, experiencing, learning. So that was the beginning of my journals. I put them out on the table. The first journal, I think, is on this table. It's called Morning of Light. It was written during those 6 years. My daughter then, of course, ends up marrying and remains in Egypt, so we go back and forth. And 12 years later, gave birth to the second journal, which is called Afternoon of Honey. And we kept going back and forth to Egypt, of course. and I kept writing and painting, and I told myself if I lived long enough, there would be a third journal, Evening of Jasmine. So each one of these represents about 8 to 10 years worth of writing and painting.
And how does this one fit?
This one fits in that the hardback books, which are illustrated with my paintings and very labor intensive to produce. They were produced for my children, but they're also on sale, but they are truly cost prohibitive to produce a book. They sell for about $70. So I realized I couldn't share Egypt through these journals because it just didn't make sense. So last year, I spent the year with my daughter in Egypt who did my editing and combined them together into this book,
Camels and goats.
Camels, Goats, and Call to Prayer. So these are the 3 journals. All of them, some of them may have been shortened a little bit just for space purposes, but they are exactly as they were written in the original journals. So my first slide, I thought this was probably a good painting to show of what it was like to go from Houston, Texas to Cairo, Egypt. And we had a sign in our mailroom that said, "Dorothy, you are not in Kansas anymore," and how true that was. So it's quite a shock to move from a first world country to a third world country, from the United States to a Muslim country, and to experience it as a family, as a woman, as a Christian, and the little bit I knew about Egypt was minuscule. I knew nothing really about Islam in terms of a religion. Unfortunately, the only thing I really kind of knew about Islam was the negative news reports. So that, the association with terrorism and all of the negative press, but really truly nothing about what is their faith like and how do they live it. Well, it was a very eye-opening experience and a very good one. The third thing that as an artist, I knew nothing about was we tend to study Western civilization, Western art, unless you begin to specialize. So I knew nothing about Islamic art. So that too was very interesting to me. So this painting was done in 1993. It was probably from one of our first trips into the countryside outside of Cairo. Cairo's population at that time, I believe, was probably around 14 million. It has surpassed 20 million for sure. And it's really a population that they have a hard time counting. And the reason being that there's not only the population that, of course, that are in homes and filling out maybe a census, but you have a population that lives in the streets, and you have a population that lives on the rooftops, and you have a population that lives in the cemeteries. Okay. Yeah.
Did this boy pose for you?
No.
Because I wondered if that would be a violation of their religion.
It's not a violation. It's a sensitive thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's more cultural than religious that they would shy away from being photographed. I may have waited for him to pause, but I try to never ask them to pose for me because I would get some really silly stuff going on like this. And I wanted to capture what this was like, just seeing this little boy with his donkeys. So I built up a huge library of photographs and mostly of the people because that's where, for me, that's where the beauty was.
So the young boys wouldn't be wearing jeans and t-shirts, they'd be wearing more
That-
traditional garb,
Yes,
and that's still the case.
that's still the case if they are of that class. In other words, country people, farmers, the poorer class. You only get into Western clothing if they're of a slightly upper, not even upper class, but a different class of Egyptian, more educated. It's possible that this child is illiterate. That doesn't explain his clothing. This is the traditional dress of the countryside. So, all right, so here's the call to prayer and pray. The call to prayer takes place 5 times a day. I absolutely fell in love with the call to prayer. It's really, really beautiful to hear it being called out from the minarets over the city simultaneously, their voices blending and just, filling the air. It really does cause you to stop in your tracks and just, if nothing else, think about it. So here we go.
Now, is the call done manually or?
Both. Record, a lot of it now is recorded, but the muezzin is the name of the person, the imam, who usually a lifetime, he will maybe be born into the tradition of a muezzin, and he would climb that minaret and call out. So you still you hear both.
What's the language in Egypt?
Arabic. You might like. Get a sense of what it was like.
And that, what we just heard, is for a particular one of the 5 times, or it's the same thing?
It's the same
Five
thing as
times
far
a
as I know. I don't understand enough of the Arabic. I know the morning one, they do, the wording includes something like, it is better to pray than to sleep. something along those lines, yeah.
Always new.
But it is
Still
clockwork.
dark the first time on.
Huh?
It's still dark on the first one.
Yes, and it is clockwork. You will hear this no matter what is going on, and they will stop and pray. So, take their little prayer rugs. You might see them lined up on the sidewalk. In my husband's office, it would be in their office. I was just talking about that they used to say if they needed to go to the bathrooms themselves, they had to go way before noon, because before noon, all the Egyptian employees would be doing their ablutions in the bathroom and making a mess of the bathroom. And then you couldn't cross the prayer in front of the men as they prayed. So,
And what about the women?
the women, it's very private. I have never seen a woman pray in public. But we had an Egyptian maid that came once or twice a week, and she would pray in our home. She would get her veil and go back in the back bedroom and pray. So they, I'm quite sure, are pretty faithful to their prayer routines too. So, okay, so we're kind of on the subject of religion, and this painting I did, and I called it Believers because I felt like as I got to see the practice of Islam, I realized that unlike what we think, we probably have more in common than what we don't have in common. And it boils down to love God, love thy neighbor, with just different traditions. And the Islamic traditions, I think, are very, very beautiful. And I don't know all of them in order, but some of the important tenets of their faith is of course, to pray 5 times a day, to fast during Ramadan, which is a full month of fasting, to, of course, give charity, to give what you have. And one of the beautiful practices they have in Islam and during Ramadan is when the fast starts, and that changes because it's tied into a lunar cycle. So, it gets really, really hard when their month of fasting falls in the summer months, as you can imagine, because they do not eat and they do not drink
Until it gets dark.
until the end of the fast. And they actually shoot off a cannon in Cairo to signal to the city that the fast has ended. When that fast ends, they are called to share what they have, what little they have, or what abundance they have. So for example, if you're a poor man, you would possibly fill they have these stone water vessels scattered throughout the city, and they are there so people have water to drink. Because if nothing else, you would provide water. It's a desert society, it's very necessary. So if that's what you can do, you would tend to keep that water vessel filled, if that's what you had. If you had a piece of pita bread and that's all you had, you would break it in half and share it. If you were wealthy, you were called to share your wealth. We had, as a neighbor, a very, very wealthy architect who happened to just live on the, I'm going to say block, because his home was very large and our apartment was up on the 6th floor, so I could watch this. And every day for 30 days, he would fill the streets between our two, the property where our apartment was and his property, with tables and benches. And at the end of the fast, he would feed 1,000 people every night for 30 days.
Oh my God.
So again, you don't hear about this in the West. You don't hear about their generosity and their adherence to what charity really is. When they celebrate the big feast, which falls 60 days after the end of Ramadan, that is a feast of slaughtering. And if you can afford to slaughter an animal, you do so, and then you share that meat. Well, our second year in Egypt, I asked Mike, I said, I would like to slaughter an animal this year and participate in, the practice. So we did. We had a butcher bring a lamb to our house and slaughter. It was awful. What was I thinking? And, because then they place their hands in the blood and they'll do the handprints on your home to bless your home. And we did that. And then a third of your meat is for yourself and your family. A third of it is for maybe immediate neighbors and friends that you would share it with. And a third of it is for the poor in the streets. And then you would go out and portion out this meat, and which we did. It was gone within minutes, because the poor wait on that particular day. It may be the only chance they have to consume meat, that month. I don't know, but extreme poverty. So again, practices that are very foreign to us, but I used to say, think about that compared to we write a check. It's so clean, put it in the mail, you've done your bit. But theirs is really hands-on. They really live the tenets of their faith. So it was very impressive. I was treated with a great deal of respect as a Christian. There was no animosity shown to me ever. I will say, and I'm a little ashamed to say, that when they were being overly generous with their food and insisting that you have one more bite, I finally learned how to say, I really can't, I'm fasting. They would back off so fast. So once I learned how to say anasayma, which means I'm fasting, that would put an end to pushing food on me. So you had to use.
I'm a vegetarian, it doesn't work, huh?
No. Mm-mm. Well, a lot of their food is vegetarian, a lot of beans and whatnot. So, okay. So again, here's this is out in the desert, Wadi Natrun, which is a Coptic Christian monastery. Christianity was brought to Egypt, I think, in the 3rd century by Saint Mark. So a lot of these monasteries are very, very old. And this is how a Coptic priest is dressed, with the hat, with the Coptic crosses embroidered in this cap or hood type thing. And they would wear a black necklace that was made out of like leather cording, and then the cross was done in swirls and formed into a cross. And I'm ashamed to say, all I could think of was licorice. But just to give you an example of a Christian, about 15% of the population is Christian. The rest are Muslim. Okay. One of my very, very first outings in Egypt was to go to the Wissawassif Weaving Center, which is what would have been in the countryside of Cairo, not anymore. It's incorporated into the grand metropolis of the city now. There, what would have been countryside is now city. So out in the area by the pyramids. And Wissawassif was an Egyptian architect, a very renowned architect who believed that children were born with an innate ability to express themselves, to be creative. So what he did was he built this little weaving village and invited the children to come and actually live there. So he's probably solving an economic problem as well, as they learn to weave and enable them to, number one, eventually grow into a cottage industry that would support their families. But mainly it was to prove their incredible artistic expression with no real instruction other than possibly the technique. And they were encouraged to weave scenes from their village life. Their weavings are absolutely stunning, and have become collectible really all over the world. Two wall-size weavings hang in the Cairo Opera House. I mean, we're talking thousands of dollars for weaving, but to watch them being executed, I think my next slide shows a weaver. And what always intrigued me was they wove their threads. I mean, I don't know about weaving from the bottom up. And I'm thinking, how do you envision your picture from the bottom up? I could maybe do it from the top down, but maybe more this way, but the bottom up. With no pattern, she's weaving an incredibly intricate village scene there.
Using silk or cotton?
Cotton. Now, there may be some silk in that, I'm not sure. But they take many months to execute. And I never go to Cairo that I don't go back to the Weaving Center, because I just, as an artist, it just absolutely intrigues me that that he had this vision and it was spot on. So. Her veiling is, now here's an example. She's wearing a colorful dress. Her veiling indicates that she's a married woman. So there's a lot that you can tell by the way their traditional dresses change. And I'll show you in paintings that might illustrate that. Okay, the next really memorable visit was the camel market, and believe me, I was not in Kansas anymore. They bring the camels up from the Sudan. They call it the 40-day road because it takes about 40 days to bring the camels into market. And then the camel dealers get going, the bartering, and it's loud and it's confusing, and there's sheep and camels and maybe a few that have passed away. It's quite an experience. I put here that the information was that there are about 120,000 camels in Egypt today, and there are around 380,000 taxis in Cairo. So why did I put those two things together? Well, because for one thing, it's not unusual to see a camel in the back of a truck in traffic as you're driving around the city. But the other thing was going back to the population of the city. Again, like I said, it's about 20 million, probably higher than that now. You could never get used to that number of people or that number of vehicles. And I drove, God knows how, but I did drive in Cairo's traffic. The only thing I felt that saved me was the traffic was so dense, you could never pick up enough speed to have any really bad accident. There were going to be a lot of skirmishes, but nothing necessarily fatal, at least not in the city, because you weren't moving fast enough for that to happen.
Were the camels too, for use in the desert, or were they being used to eat?
Both, for their meat and for work.
So you can go to a butcher shop, and it would be really common to see camels.
In fact, in the butcher shops, they usually beat the tails on the carcasses so you know what animal you're buying. Details you don't need to know. Yeah, butcher experience is really tough. I remember two experiences in terms of buying meat in Egypt. One of them was, it was Thanksgiving and we wanted a turkey. So I go down to the local market and I asked the fellow who sells poultry, I said, I want a turkey. And about
Did you
how
know what a
big.
turkey was?
Yeah. And he says about how big. I said, I don't know, for a family. And he goes back and he comes back and he throws me a live turkey. He goes, is this a good size? Is this what you want? I'm like, so that was our first Thanksgiving in Egypt. And then you buy the turkey and they clean it and you bring it home and it's still warm. Now, I was so thrilled when I found a grocery store where you could buy your meat that was under cellophane. It was civilization.
You
So-
mentioned driving, there's no problem with women driving, like, it's not like Saudi Arabia
No,
where.
not at all. To cover that question, Egypt is probably the most Western in terms of their mindset and their traditions. Although they're very devout Muslims, they're not fundamentalist in their practices or their beliefs. So it was not difficult to live among them because they were very generous and very kind and really very understanding. This is probably a good time to just talk about women and how we should have been dressing and did dress, most of us. And that is, there was no need to veil. We weren't expected to veil. We were expected, even if it was unspoken, to dress modestly and to understand the tenets of Islam when it comes to modesty in your dress. And this is important even as a tourist because quite honestly, a lot of tourists will go to Egypt and say, well, I'm not Egypt, and in my country, we can dress like this, and if they don't like it, too bad. Well, that's not a smart way to begin your time in Egypt.
Or anywhere.
Or anywhere, exactly. So how to dress in Egypt. Now, again, I'm talking 30 years ago, so this truly will be outdated, but to just give you an example, it isn't a question of just covering your skin, like not being sleeveless. It's true they don't want to see women's skin, so you do, back then, I don't know that it's true anymore, you were sure to cover your arms. You were sure to wear skirts that were below the knees. But the most important thing is, you could dress according to this and still be improper. Because if you're wearing very, very tight clothing, you are showing off the female anatomy, and that is where the problem lies. So, if you're in skin-tight leggings and a little halter top, your skin's covered, but they can see everything they need to see in terms, that's offensive. And as a traveler in Egypt, do you have to dress like a nun? No. But keep in mind certain things. I typically wore long skirts and kind of loose tops, and when I moved from Egypt to Italy, I looked at my wardrobe and it looked like I was a missionary coming in, compared to what was being worn in Italy. But if you showed an awareness of this as a foreign woman, they were very respectful and I think grateful that you understood, the norms of their living. So, okay, the camel dealers, and I will give you 6 camels for your daughter. If I heard it once, I heard it 1,000 times. My son-in-law never offered me camels. He still owes me. But this is the men gathering. They look pretty friendly, but I can assure you this probably followed a very animated, aggressive amount of dealing among them about the camels.
Now, are these markets weekly or twice a
Yes,
year?
weekly.
Weekly.
And how would you describe the mainstay of the economy? What do most people do for a living?
Well, again, whatever my answer is, it will be a dated answer, but I mean, it's a class society, so you have a level of professional men and women, so women enter, the professions. Many of the upper class Egyptians will travel outside their country, and they will, if they have enough money, they will opt to have an education in the West, the UK, the United States, somewhere else in Europe. It's very important to them. Yeah, so it's very important to them. The rich are very, very rich, and the poor are very, very poor. So the poor fill every possible level of the service industry that you can imagine, even if it's just opening a door for you, so.
Does the government provide any service, social security, safety nets? Like
No.
medical, education?
I don't know, again, and I don't know how much of this is government or church, or not church, mosque, but there is within Islam a level of social protection. But I couldn't answer the question in terms of what exactly would the government provide. It's a hard life. They're very, very
Is school free?
as far as I know, yes. The public school.
Right. And to what grade level?
I would imagine probably at least until 8th grade is mandatory, and then one to high school. Not beyond that. I mean, that would be whether you can afford it. Most of them train to go into a trade, whatever the family business is. This is a man who was selling his honey in our neighborhood. So again, these scenes are of your everyday life. That could have been 1,000 years ago. The crock on his shoulder, looks like stuff they found in the pyramids. So remnants of ancient Egypt are to be seen everywhere. So I just thought it was interesting that you still see this in your everyday life. And if I wanted to buy his honey, which I didn't, because it kind of scared me, you would buy it this way. And he would go through the streets, kind of like the call to prayer, and just call out that he had his honey for sale.
And pour it into a little container that you brought out.
Yes, people would bring out. Kind of like the Italians do with wine. So fill your jug. Okay. Again, a woman at the market. Now, when I would go to the local market, which I love to do, again, it would be the peasantry, so they will not be in Western dress. They will be in the long galabeah, the black veil. She's married. And they would just sit on the curb and try to sell whatever they grew. So now I took some quotes from my journal when I did this. Like, she took her guinea is a pound note. At that time, a pound was worth maybe about 30 cents. It's worth nothing, absolutely nothing now. If it was the first sale of the day, she would kiss it and touch it to her forehead. So there were all these beautiful, beautiful gestures that illustrated their faith. That gratitude that I've made a sale today. Kiss the money, put it to her forehead. So very, very beautiful to witness. Okay, so now we've traveled to Upper Egypt, This is in Aswan, which is probably the most southern part of the Nile. And then you start moving into the Sudan. Absolutely, absolutely stunning, the landscape. The Egyptians themselves are, as you go to get into Upper Egypt and Nubia, are very, very dark, very strong, very beautiful, beautiful features. And you see over and over again reflections of pharaohs and you know, it hasn't changed. The features are really, really quite beautiful. This is my favorite spot in the world, is this scene. And that's why I did use it for the cover of the book. Okay, so. Again, another one from sailing on the Nile. I am just ashamed of how blessed I am to say that I have sailed the Nile 8 times, I think. Never tire of it because it is like passing through a biblical landscape. You know, the way of life is unchanged.
So none of the dams have affected us.
What's that?
None of the dams have affected the Nile.
Oh, yes, most definitely. One of the reasons why Cairo is so overpopulated is once they built the dam and inundated the farmlands to do it, the farmers lost their way of life. And so they migrated to Cairo in search of a living. So it has changed that in terms of influencing the Great Migration. And they moved into the city to fulfill jobs like watching over apartment buildings, service, menial tasks, anything to support their families. Or the father will come without his family, like many immigrants, make enough money, send the money home, that sort of thing. So it did affect their livelihood quite a bit. But it was a necessary thing to support the needs of the country too. Okay, so here is a felucca captain. Felucca is the traditional sailing vessel of the Nile. He's very, very dark because he's Nubian, which means he comes almost from the border with the Sudan. So the complexions of the Egyptians are anywhere from a very fair complexion, you could see it in the north, all the way to very, very almost black skin. But for sure, if they are dark complected, more than likely they are from Upper Egypt. His Galabeah, for example, if I wasn't going to guess he was from Nubia or Upper Egypt by his complexion, I would know it by his Galabeah, because his Galabeah has these big wide sleeves, okay? You don't see those sleeves in Cairo. And if you see him in Cairo, he's a migrant to the city. Just interesting little things that you learn. And they're also the brunt of many, many Egyptian jokes. You know, every country has somebody that they're going to make fun of. And of course, they make fun of the Upper Egyptians as being, you know, kind of country bumpkins of the country. Okay, so here's a portrait of a Nubian woman. Again, very, very dark. Would I know she's Nubian? Yes, I would know it from her dress. And the reason I know it from her dress is her Galabeah is colorful. In other words, it's not solid black. But overlaid the Galabeah itself is a black lace or netting full dress that covers that. So, and the headdress, of course, is different from what you see in Cairo. So I know from her dress that she's from Nubia. These are 2 sketches I did. One of them, the one on the right, is of a Nubian woman that I did, well, 2019. And about a year after sketching her, I just couldn't get over her face, and I said, Nefertiti, there she is. I mean, this is the sort of thing you saw. These are two women thousands of years apart, and yet the remnants are there to see.
You did a beautiful job capturing Nefertiti.
I know.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Nubian notes. This was again, if you look at her dress, it's colorful, and you can kind of tell that I have the sheer lacy overdress on top of it, and the black veiling. So young girl has to be married because her veiling is black, and they do marry very, very young in the countryside.
Are those arranged marriages or?
Absolutely, there are a lot of them are,
Yeah.
yes. And actually, I would say among this class of people, probably pretty successfully too. You know, chosen for compatibility and to share the labor and whatnot. I mean, they don't aspire to other things because that's what they've known. And I don't think they're unhappy people. So,
Ginda, you mentioned that the married ladies wear black veil. Do the unmarried wear white or just other
they'll wear
colors?
a more colorful scarf.
Colorful.
Yeah, they'll still cover the hair. The object is to cover their hair, and I found this, I didn't understand it at first, and I found this really interesting. The reason they cover their hair is because it's considered distracting to men. It's a temptation to show off your beauty. Now, certainly I don't think my hair is a big attraction, so covering it up would not be necessary. And I visited weekly young girls at an orphanage. I kind of adopted about 6 of them. And they were in such need of just affection and motherly love. And I knew that I could give them that. So we would go and we would, plop down on their beds and tell jokes, and they would show me how to belly dance and, just talk about teenage things from their point of view. It was really a very, very lovely experience to have had. One of the gals, I never saw not veiled. Now, at that age, in their teens, they're not, I wouldn't say they're not expected to veil. It's a family decision usually. Usually the father, of course, being the predominant one, would say it's time for you to start veiling as kind of a protective measure against her being a target of desire, temptation. So they cover their hair. So all that, I knew for 6 years, and I probably knew her for 40 years, never saw her unveiled. And one of the times I went to visit, she had her veil off. I was stunned by her beauty. You would not have thought, maybe that's why nuns veil. I mean, it'd be interesting to kind of research why do nuns cover their hair? Because, the face alone, it could still be an attractive face, but hair really adds something to female beauty. And she had this long, wavy black hair, and I'm telling you, I was just gutted by her beauty. So I could see why Dad would want a veil on that girl. In fact, our daughter Bernadette, the one that lives there, she's blonde and blue-eyed. And the first time we took her down into the ancient market in Cairo, we had so many camels they wanted to give us. It was just obnoxious. And my husband finally turned to her and said, next time you're veiling. So we're still in Upper Egypt here. 2 shepherds. I just love. Now see, they're in Galabeas. Their sleeves are wide, so that tells us they're Upper Egyptian. Probably a grandfather and a grandson here. And I did have them pose, and they didn't get too silly on me because I knew I wanted to paint them. But again, the dress tells you where they're from. And the young boy, maybe he's schooled, maybe he's not. But he's going to do what his fathers and grandfathers did before him. And they're content. So what's there to fix, you know? Okay, so Hajj Muhammad, probably the most desired and most important part of the tenets of Islam is to ultimately go to Mecca and circle the Kaaba. When they are able to, now that for the wealthy folks, it's not a problem. Just buy your first class plane ticket, you fly. But for the poor, they get there by all sorts of means. It could be, you know, starting with a train. It could be, you know, then a truck, then a bus, you know, then a camel. And when they return, they quite often, again, this is in the villages, you don't see it too much in Cairo, but in the villages, they will paint the story of their pilgrimage on the outside of their homes and how they got there. So it's not unusual, and I don't remember what else was on the outside of his home, but they'll paint the airplane or the camel or all the means that finally got them to Mecca.
And their plan is to do that once a lifetime.
Once in a lifetime.
Yes, you could do it.
You can do it more than
Everyone
once,
might
and
need to
the
do it.
wealthy people probably do. But for the average Egyptian, it's almost an impossibility. So if you, and the story that I wrote about Hajj Muhammad is, he had invited us into his home. He had raised, I don't know, half a dozen kids. He was very, very proud of this. He had a cook stove and he had a flush toilet, and he wanted me to see these because it was like the ultimate creature comforts, that he had worked hard enough, he could provide for his family comfort, and he was blessed to see that. It's very humbling to see this. And again, how did I get into their homes? How did I get into to talk to these people? I did it by learning enough Arabic, and it doesn't take a whole lot to please them. In Upper Egypt, I had learned that the greetings, the first greeting in Arabic is Sabah al-Khair, which means morning of goodness, and the response might be Sabah al-Nur, which means morning of light, hence the title of my first book, Morning of Light. When you get into Upper Egypt, that greeting exchange becomes very, very poetic and elongated. So you may have a round of 6 exchanges. And I learned that they do this. And if you learn something that is really theirs and you show that you know it, they love it. So after the morning of light and the morning of goodness, you know, morning of the Nile, morning of the cream, anything that's pretty, anything that evokes this kind of poetic magic. And so I would do that. That was my in there. Come on in and have a tea together. And so I would go into all these homes and see what oases where the women are very, very isolated. They don't leave their homes. Now that's a whole other culture. I wanted to see how they lived. So I hired a boy who had a little donkey cart to take me around, and he said, well, what do you want to see and what do you want to do? I said, I want to go visit your mother. He said, okay. And that got me into their homes, and then they invited all the women neighbors, and we sat on the dirt floor, and we talked. And what did we talk about? In my limited vocabulary, we talked about being wives and mothers and our children and what we want. And that doesn't change. We all want the same thing. We all want the same thing for our families. And but they were so generous. You know, that's all it took was a friendly greeting, the appropriate dress, a few Arabic words, and you're good. So well worth learning just a few little things about their culture to really open the doors to get an inside glimpse of their lives. Water buffalo market was pretty much like the camel market, except it's all water buffaloes. This is Upper Egypt because they're used to work the land and also for buffalo milk and for the meat. I love the face of this young boy. I painted him after I left Egypt. You know, some of their faces just stay with you. And I've kept very few. I did probably about, I think, 120 paintings of Egypt. 90% of them were of the people. I have kept in my personal collection maybe 10 of them. This was one I kept because he just reminds me of Egypt. You know, the dress, the burnished skin, the kind of contemplative look he has, just drew me in. Karima was our street sweeper. She, her salary was maybe the equivalent of $7 a month. So very, very poor. And when I would leave my apartment and maybe have my paint and my easel in hand to go somewhere and paint, she would appear out of nowhere, drop her broom, and carry my easel and watch me set up and watch me at least start the painting because I had no idea how do you make that come alive on that piece of paper. So we had this wonderful, wonderful relationship of it was just a sweetness, you know, of this generous, sweet, beautiful woman who just kind of appeared off and on throughout my days. What I didn't know was she was probably, when I met her, already about 7 months pregnant, but because of the size of her galabea, I had no idea there was a baby beneath that. So when her baby was born, she brought her to me to see. And I did this portrait of the two of them. Now, what I loved about it was the only colorful thing that Karima ever wore, because she was always in black, was her little kerchiefs. And they were always these brilliant colors, you know, purple and red and green. You'd think, well, big deal, but you're talking about this standing out in a very poor, dusty, dirty environment. It just pops out at you. And for her, who had so very little, to maybe have a sense that wearing that color, you know, was going to brighten her day and maybe brighten somebody else's day. And sure enough, her little baby had her headscarf on the day she brought her to see me. I don't think you see it that well in my portrait, or at least this photograph, but the baby had black eyeliner on and up and lower, you know, lids. And the reason for that, of course, pediatricians don't like it, but they do it to ward off the evil eye. So there's a lot of traditions that are not Islamic, but cultural, that you will see. So I think the baby's name was Amin. She had the black kohl on her eyes, and she had a little amulet tied around her neck to ward off the evil eye. And
So she's unmarried, so she's not wearing a veil, right?
she is married. But she is married. Most definitely. She is without the black veil, probably for, at least in my portrait of her, the nature of her work. I mean, she's bending and sweeping and all of this, so the black veil could fall down. I mean, no, she has usually a black veil on top of that. But I think she let it fall and let it be on her shoulders on purpose.
See, that's why you appealed to her as an artist, because she had her own sense of color.
Yeah.
She had a splotch of color too, and everybody appreciated it.
I'll stop here to tell a story about Karima, because make sure I don't go.
You're fine. You've got 40 minutes.
Okay, well,
Plenty of time.
Karima, when my neighbor who did the break the fast meal during Ramadan, would set up those tables. And year after year, I would say, I don't want to go eat. They're called God's tables. I want to eat at one of the God's tables. Well, the Egyptians that I knew were of a certain class. They were educated and they were going to have no parts of this fancy I had about eating among the poor. That was just not happening. So my last year in Egypt, I looked down and I watched him set up those tables. And I said, by God, this is the year. So I'm walking home and Karima is already seated at one of the tables. The fast that year, I think, broke around 5 o'clock. Because, of course, that changes each year because of the lunar cycle. And she said, Dolly, come eat with us today. I said, I'll be right down. So I go upstairs and I call my husband. I said, I'm eating at the God's tables tonight. And I know he was rolling his eyes, but I said, I just want you to know where I am. And so I went down and I sat with her. Now, within this group, all of whom were poor, there was even within that class system, kind of a subclass and a subclass. So the men that I knew that were boawives that guard the buildings were a little higher up, and of course they were men, and I was friendly with them because I greeted everybody when I went out, and they'd go, why are you eating with those street sweepers? You know, they're dirty. And, you know, I kind of flicked him off and said, no, this is where I'm eating. So we waited, and you have to wait for the cannon to go off. And meanwhile, they're delivering pita bread, and they're delivering, you know, an orange. And some of the other parts of the meal are being delivered, and that's purely for practical reasons. You got 1,000 people that are very, very hungry. And I noticed all the street sweepers and whoever else her friends were had, you know, like pockets in their bodices or in their galabaya. And, you know, the next thing I know, their fruit would kind of disappear, you know. And then the guy would come around and they'd do this, but you missed me. So I was dropping things in her bag because they were going to take this food home. And he came around and I said, you missed me. But he, you know, he probably gave me 2 fruits. But when it came time to deliver the main course of the meal, which was some sort of meat stew and beans, not a whole lot of meat, but it did have meat in it, he really did. He was pulling out the choice pieces of meat. And that was, to me, as a foreigner and as a woman, he was being a host, you know. He was going to give me, as their guest, the best that he had. And I, by then, had gotten really good at, like, putting half the meat, because they would take half their pita pocket, fill it, you know, and it would go inside here or down in there, or a little bag at their feet. So the cannon goes off, the end of the fast prayers, you know, the muezzin calls, and they do the call to prayer. Then they break the fast with a date that has been soaking in a little glass of water. And honestly, you know, I wasn't one to drink the water of Cairo because, you know, pretty scary. And this wasn't the only time I did this, but I said to myself, we are sharing a moment of faith together. I'm going to have faith that I'm not going to get an amoeba or the mummy's tummy for the next 7 days. So I ate the food with them, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. So that was my relationship with Karima. And I don't know, here, when I say she pulled her, she was talking to my mother. My mother was visiting. And she wanted to tell my mother what our relationship was like. And this is what she did with her right hand. She pulled her fingers together like this, like a folding flower. And then she kissed the flower. And then she raises her hand again, that the sweetness of our relationship is like this flower under heaven. So there are all these things. So without words, she told me how she felt about me. And if you take time, you learn what they're trying to tell you, even without words. So it really was very, very, very beautiful. And I have to say, I experienced Egypt on a level that most foreigners did not. But when I landed in Cairo for that year that was going to change my daughter's life forever, I said, I am not wasting a minute of this. This is just a gift. And it turned into a bigger gift than I ever hoped for.
Did your husband's company, did they try to do any orientation, or were they all?
They did, very much so. And it was actually a very fun orientation. We had an Arabic teacher who lied to us the entire course, which was really fun, and lied to us. And she's quite a jokester. But the Egyptians, they're very playful people. So, she would tell us things like she was a belly dancer, but she was always serious. She told us her name was Noor, which means light. I thought, oh, that's so beautiful. I meet her in the shopping center like a year later, and I call her Noor, and she goes, who the hell's Noor? So, Noor, you're my Arabic teacher. But what she did in the class was we all had to assume an Arabic name and an Arabic profession. Okay, so we play acted. And then she would have us enact scenes that were very likely going to be part of our life in the city, which was a wonderful way to teach a language. For one thing, if you were messing up as a student, that wasn't you, that was whoever your other personality was. It wasn't Ginda, we didn't know how to say that. That was Karima, In fact, my name was Karima. But it liberated you to make mistakes and to be playful. And it's a wonderful way to learn language. So she would have things like, musical chairs, but we would have to be fruits. So we would learn the names of the fruits for the market. Oh, she had more than one lesson on getting in a taxi. Life-saving classes on getting in a taxi about how you had to negotiate your fare before you even set foot in that taxi, how you had to get bodily out of the taxi before you handed over your money, or if they weren't happy, they might take off with you. Negotiating taxis was huge. You were never to admit you were American because that meant you were very, very wealthy. Tell them you're from Yugoslavia or, whatever, but you're not from America. So she taught us this, and she taught us how to do it in Arabic. And then I very quickly learned little expressions that were so colloquial to their culture that they just cracked up. They had an expression that the English translation would be in apricot season. Well, what's the big deal? Your answer would be in apricot seasons. Well, the apricot season in Egypt is very, very short. So the meaning of the expression was really when hell freezes over. Yeah, I'm going to do that when apricots are in bloom. And they would laugh and laugh and laugh because they don't expect that from a foreigner, to know and to use it appropriately. And there were a lot of things, and I was guilty of this, but this was self-protection. We did use elements of Islam to express certain things because we knew it would get us what we needed, because that they would understand. For example, as a woman, my opinion really didn't matter how much. It would be up to my husband, the mister, we used to call him the mister. And so if they were trying to get you to do something that you didn't want to do, and you would say, well, I really don't want to do that, or I really don't want to buy that, you could argue the whole of apricot season, And so we finally learned to say, oh, my husband would be very unhappy. End of subject, move on. That would put an end to it. And that would be whether you were speaking to another Egyptian woman or an Egyptian man. Blame it on the mister. If you don't want to do it, tell him your husband's going to be very angry if you do this. Done. You don't want to make the mister. And so, you take their culture, and we did. We would use it to our advantage when we could. Fati was the Boab, they're called Boabs. He guarded the building next to ours. Now, he was elderly, so his task was really just to watch, okay? I can't imagine what his salary was, but, you know, it was $10 a month, that was probably generous. When the migrants come into Cairo, they will quite often squat in a building that's being constructed, because each building in the city has a guard. And that person, their task is to watch the building, so they know everybody's business, who's coming and who's going. Watching the building is the main occupation. The other thing is they will wash your car, and cars need to be washed about every day because of the sand and the dust. If you want to see out your windshield, you need a car wash almost every day. So they will wash your car. We used to laugh because they clean the windows with dirty rags, and they leave the windshield wipers out, so we would know the car had been washed, because otherwise you might not have known the car had been washed. But these are the sort of tasks that they would do. They would carry your groceries in. Very, very helpful. For the most part, agreeable individuals. I lived in more than one building. Our Boab was kind of useless, but you know, hey, win some, you lose some. But Fatih was just this gentle, gentle soul, and every time I turned the corner, he would be there to greet me. And I would walk up, and as I say here, I would place my hand in his paw-like grip, and he would hold it, and I would let it rest there in the blessing that it imparted. And that was our relationship, kind of like Karima, a lot of nonverbal, just human touch. When I had known him about a year when he came to me, and he was very hesitant, and because a lot of them are very quick to ask for help because they know we have money by comparison. You know, you didn't have to be wealthy to be wealthy in Cairo. And he came to me and he said, my wife needs glasses. Could you help me purchase her glasses? And I said, I'll talk to the mister. And I said, Mike, let's help him. Now, you had to be, one of the hardest things for me in Cairo is the need is crushing. It is absolutely overwhelming. There is no way you could fix anything. So you have to put blinders on because you'll go crazy if you don't. And then you have to be selective. And after about a year of being extremely frustrated, a friend of mine said, Jenny, you just haven't lived in a third world country long enough. You'll learn. And so for me, the learning was a decision to help one person at a time. If I could help this one person with his need, then that's what I could do. I can't help all the others. You can't. So we decided, yes, we would. So I took the prescription for the eyeglasses to an eyeglass store, and they read it because I couldn't read it. They said, this isn't for glasses. She needs glaucoma surgery. So I went back and I talked to the mister, and we decided, yes, we would see her through her surgery. So I called an Egyptian man I know who was Christian, an eye surgeon, an artist, and a concert pianist. Talk about a man with blessed hands.
You have classy friends, Jen.
I mean, really. And I met him actually through our art. That's how we met. But I went to him not for any of those reasons, other than the fact that I knew he was an eye surgeon, and I wasn't going to take this on unless it was with a reliable doctor. He performed the surgery. There was no fee. I mean, again, just here was a man in need. I asked, would he do this? She was hospitalized for 3 days because they just keep them there. It's not like the U.S. And she came home, and then we went and got the glasses she needed. Another year went by, and he asked us if we would help with his surgery, and he also needed surgery. these are things, I mean, the whole bill for the hospital portion of it, I mean, it's subsidized, obviously, it was on our part maybe $100. He would have not been able to afford this in a lifetime. It was just never gonna happen. So, you know, we took care of his eyes. We were then invited to his daughter's wedding. He had 5 sons and then a daughter. This was the last one to be married. It was huge. We were the only guests to arrive in a car. That's how poor they were. And we were in a street that was just a dirt street with, you know, some folding chairs set up and a stage because the bride and groom are always on thrones on a stage. And as honored guests, we got a 7-Up. So we're talking extremely poor. A night of festivity like you wouldn't believe, the dancing and, you know, dad shooting off guns into the air. You know. But we stayed as long as we could take it and we left. But I was very, very honored by that, the fact that it was his way of acknowledging what we had done in their lives. The last year we were in Egypt, his son, who had a horrible, horrible cataract on his one eye, had come to me and he said, I've seen a doctor and he can do the surgery on my eye. And he sold his wife's, they together, it was an agreement, his wife's wedding ring, the gold, to pay for this surgery. And he's telling me this. I said, you know, I'll tell you what, why don't we have you seen by the doctor that has done your parents? And just be sure that this is what's necessary. So I call Fareed, the eye doctor, and I say, the son has a terrible cataract. I don't know more than that, but they say they can do surgery, but would you give us a second opinion? And he said, I'm hanging an art show, but if you'll come to the gallery, I'll bring my kit and I'll examine it. And so he did a pretty thorough examination and he turned and looked at me because he was fluent in English, Western educated, as the upper class Egyptian would have been. And he said to me, he needs a corneal transplant. This is not a fixable problem. It was an accidental splashing of lye into his eye, very caustic, very common injury in Egypt. They paint their farm structures and whatever. And he said, I'm sorry. He said, I'm sorry. He said that he'll never be a candidate for this surgery. And I said, well, why wouldn't he be? He said, because he has one functioning eye. He has a good eye, and he has a job. And the need again in Egypt is, he could go on a list, but it's never going to happen. So I looked at him and I said, have you told him this? And he said, not yet. I said, well, will you please be the one to explain all this to him? And he did, and I can't think of his name right now, but he literally collapsed and was sobbing. And this moment that I witnessed proved to me what I have said all along between our faiths. This man, this doctor, this Christian lifted him up and put his arms around him and held him until he had finished crying. And sent us home. And the next day I went to him and I said, you know, I can't do anything for you. I said, here's the money, go buy a ring for your wife, a new band. So that was this all took place in my final months in Egypt. So it was the giving back to a country that gave us so much. So that, Foxy, is a very, very special memory. The goat lady, she would herd her goats all through our street. Now I'm talking a very modern city, and yet it intrudes all this. So she herded her goats. We used to call her the goat ladies. Everybody wanted to photograph her, but you had to remember, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have phones that you could just click pictures. You had to have your camera, and then you had to have it developed. And I'd have to run back into the apartment. Well, you would never find her by the time you got back out on the street to take a picture. I eventually caught her, and painted the goat lady. So where I lived in Cairo was really would have been the suburbs when it was built. It was built up in like the 1940s, 50s by the British. And it was a garden community, and it's no longer, well, it's still very beautiful. It does have some green space, but it's no longer a suburb. It's just been incorporated. But it bordered the desert, so, you know, the goat ladies coming in with their goats was not unusual. Sinai Bedouin, here's another example, number one, of dress. How do I know she's from the Sinai? From the embroidery on her galabea. They're noted for their beautiful, beautiful embroidery work. And this was from just an encounter I had out in the desert in the Sinai. Again, can you tell I love goats? Springtime pasturing in the Sinai. Now the Sinai is now where my daughter lives. She and her husband are both teachers, and they taught in Cairo probably for about the first 10 years, and then just couldn't take it anymore. The city has truly become unlivable. The pollution, it's just total chaos.
The air pollution,
Oh, yeah. Big.
and then the running water is not drinkable.
Not advisable. Yeah. I mean, if you're traveling, we were told, you know, in fact, for probably the first year, our produce, we used to have to come in and literally disinfect it with, you know, Clorox and all of that. And, you know, an Egyptian friend said to me, she said, Jenna, when are you ever going to build up an immunity? Stop disinfecting your stuff and just eat it. And that was true, but I was living there. But as a tourist, you really do need to be careful. You know, you don't want to spend your trip in the John. So, woman of the desert again. You can drive for miles along a desert road and not see anybody, and then you'll come across a shepherdess, you know, grazing her lambs, her sheep.
Does the embroidery on the border of her veil, is that her tribal colors?
Not necessarily. Now, I don't have any paintings of Siwa Oasis. Their embroidery is very, very specific to them, and that is they use threads and they do designs, and they're all in these kind of gold and russet and brown and burgundy colors. And it's actually the colors as of the date palms, of the dates as they ripen. They use those colors to do their embroidery. So very tied to nature. Yeah. This, I think, is just probably, I mean, a lot of it is very repetitive. I mean, you see people doing the same designs. They use coins a lot. You'll see coins along their headbands, coins for their earrings, and things like that, old coins that are out of date. Itinerant silversmiths would probably go from encampment to encampment when they were really still very nomadic, and now they're both. They'll live in a town in a concrete structure and still go out when it's time to pasture their animals. Okay, Saidi. I was going to read, this is one of the later paintings that I did of Egypt. One of the very last ones I did, actually. And it was an encounter with a Saidi. A Saidi is a name for an Upper Egyptian. Again, well, he's got that jacket on, so you don't see the sleeves, but the big turban. And they wear a big turban. It is said, I'm not sure, I've never seen one unravel, that they're 7 feet long. And the reason they're that length is that no matter how poor they are, when they die, they will have a shroud. It will be, their turban will be used. And that's why they have these really big full turbans. Okay, so I wrote this because when I painted this, it's watercolor and pastel, mostly watercolor. But I said I think I painted it with my tears because I knew I was leaving Egypt and I wasn't ready. His head is covered in a swirled wrap of soft yellow gauze, framing an aged face illuminated by the melon-colored light of late afternoon. Kind eyes peer out of the brown earth of his crinkled face, where life has skillfully incised the story of his days, like the hieroglyphs on temple walls. I take little notice of the bead necklaces and trinkets entwined in his bony fingers. I prefer to study the bronze patina of his gnarled hands, hands that have held more precious treasures throughout his long life, a loving wife, a firstborn son, perhaps a dying mother. Strong hands that have plowed the fertile soil along the Nile, that have cut field after field of sugarcane, that have bundled fodder for his animals. Gentle hands that have held the hands of small children, hands that have caressed the scruffy flanks of a beloved donkey. Hands that stirred his sugary tea as he enjoyed his well-earned leisure, playing dominoes with his old friends in the tea house near his home. Still hands that have held the shisha to his lips at the end of the day, water bubbling in its pipe, smoke encircling his head like a gossamer crown, fragrant tobacco scents in the night air. Hands that have praised Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. Saidi, the souvenir salesman, squats before his store of goods, carefully displayed on a cardboard box. Crocheted hats, scarab bracelets, carved statues, cheap replicas of Egypt's treasures. Pharaonic loot, Pharaonic junk. Saidi, the souvenir salesman, is not discouraged that I do not buy. He wants to give me a hadaya, a small gift, because I speak Arabic. I accept the small blue scarab from his gentle, gnarled hands. He does not know that he is the gift I will take away with me. So I've always said that. It's not a scarab. But, okay, so that is the story of Saidi trying to sell me a souvenir, not knowing that I didn't need one. Bedouin tea, this is tea that I experienced in a home near my daughter in the Sinai. She had invited us to tea. And again, this was very, very interesting. Going okay time-wise?
You're okay.
Okay,
Yeah, you
all
only
right.
have 5 more slides after this.
Okay.
You have 15 minutes. We're close to.
She invited us to tea. And so her daughter led the way. The house was a mud brick home, mud floors, woven cotton rugs on the floor, and her little cook stove. And that was the room where she entertained us for guests. We sat on the floor, and she invited, her neighbor women in to join us, and we talked about children and just kind of light. And then she prepared a full-blown meal for us, which we ate with our hands. But afterwards, she spent a great deal of time, half English, half Arabic, telling me about her life. And what she displayed was an incredible affection for her father, who taught her, in her words, everything she needed to know about goats, about herding them, about providing for them, about the seasons, about her, raising her own children. And there was such incredible pride in this that, again, it contrasted to what we hear about them not valuing daughters or women. And why is this not valuable? He did what any father who loved a daughter would have done. He prepared her for her life. So it was a very beautiful moment to hear her tell us this. Like I said, half English, half Arabic. And then she had her daughters run in, and the thing that got me is she had such a sense of joy and contentment. Now, 2 things happened. first of all, her neighbor friend would watch her while she would go to Sharm el Sheikh, the resort town. And when she was there, she would go for a good stretch of time, a week, maybe 10 days. And that entire time, she goes through the dumpsters. And she goes through the dumpsters to collect anything that's usable and to collect basically foods that have been thrown away, produce mainly. And she would dry it and bundle it and bring it back to feed her goats. So this was her life. And so there was nothing odd about this at all. And she had her daughter go grab things, and she had all these bottles of cosmetics and things that the foreign tourists had thrown away. And what's this good for? Can we wash our hair with this? And can we do this? Is it good for our skin? You know. So she had me identify all the contents of all these bottles because they were going to be used. And then she showed me, the ring is on her finger. She showed me this ring, and the stone, was loose or prong, was bent or broken. And I almost said, why don't you let me take your ring and I'll fix it for you because, I do jewelry making. And I kept my mouth shut. And I knew being quiet was the right thing. Why was it right? Because in her mind, this was a precious gift. It didn't need fixing. And so was her life. It was to me a parallel to the life that she had just told me about. There was nothing that needed fixing. And I certainly didn't have there wasn't anything to fix. And she would be proud of that ring if it lost the stone. It wouldn't have mattered. And I went away wishing we could have some of that. Can we bring that back with us and try to understand the things we're seeing, that they're teaching us. So, like I said, I'm not telling you the history of the country or the archaeology. We leave that to the professors. I'm just telling you what Egypt has to teach you. And even as a tourist, yes, you won't have these experiences, but I hope you'll see Egypt in a new light. And at least for any of us, before we make judgments, we understand that theirs is a different life. And in a country that is incredibly poor, they are some of the most fun-loving, generous people you ever want to meet. And the same way with the practice of their faith. So very, very inspiring. In Dahab, 2 young kids. This is in the town where lives. It is on the Red Sea. All her neighbors, for the most part, are in mud brick homes. For a while, she was the only person on the street who owned a car. Her immediate neighbor still rode a camel to work. So again, these are all the sheep and goats that roam the streets, herds of them. And I love visiting there because the sentence I wrote is so true, that life is sanded down to smoothness here, slow pace and uncomplicated. It is kinder, gentler, more peaceful. They had very little, they had a lot. This is my daughter's gate. On one of my visits, she said, "Mom, would you make a mosaic?" This was on the right-hand side. So with the children in the area, we went around picking up, shards of broken ceramics from the streets. There wasn't any place to buy, mosaic supplies. And the top Arabic is her name and her husband's name. And then I wanted to do a scene of Dahab, which of course is the Red Sea and the Sinai Mountains and the goats. So I come back the next year to visit. She goes, "Mom, would you do something on the right-hand side or the left-hand side?" So again, we went out looking and found enough. And I engaged all the children, and they were herds of them, to help me do this. A year or two later, she says, "Mom," she said, I had prepared the wall to the left of the last mosaic. And she said, "I'm wondering if you would paint something or do something, because the town is encouraging artists to paint the different public walls and whatnot. So I agree, I'm an easy. There, yes.
Oh my gosh, look at that.
So again, nothing was purchased except the paints and the grout and the adhesive. Every shard was picked up out of the streets and even out of the dump. We went looking for colors. Now there weren't a lot of colors to be found. And very early on, I realized that I better do the bottom half in mosaics because the kids are gonna manhandle this otherwise. And I learned this because as I painted the goats and the camel of the town, the people of the town would come up and say, "That's my camel you painted," or "That's my goat." So I would have them pose in front of the animal they claimed to be theirs. But I worked in all the little elements that are very typical of the town. The gate with that hole, the hole has been left there because through that hole is where they delivered water to my daughter's house when they still had to have water delivered. And invariably, the children of the town have named my daughter Habiba, which means loved one. And when we would visit, on the other side of this wall is her little garden in front of her house, there would be a little face in that hole going, Habiba, Habiba. So I got to know these were my Bedouin grandchildren, and they would come barefoot and runny nosed and want to help to the point where I thought I was going to murder them. But they weren't the only pests that we had to deal with. The goats themselves were very busy because we would leave our supplies out on the table and go in and have lunch. I would have the tiles maybe separated by color in boxes, and when I came back out, the goats had eaten the boxes. So it was quite a task. And at the end, I would cross the street each day because I didn't have a sketch. I didn't plan anything in advance. We just attacked it every morning. It took us maybe 6 weeks, I don't know. And every evening I would cross the street just when the sun was hitting the wall, and I would study and kind of decide what I was going to tackle the next day. So this was a picture I took on the last day when it was finally finished. And the little boy who lived next door, Abdu, he came out and he went along the wall and he kissed every one of the goats. And that did it. Absolutely melted my heart. So that, I think, is my last. This is my book.
Just lovely.
The book is $20. It is a combination. All the stories that are in the journal are in the book, as well as some reproductions of the painting, but just black and white. And that was a cost decision. But if you have any other questions, if I can answer them, I will.
Oh, beautiful.
So you go back every year, you said,
About every other year.
and the sort of changes that you see are?
The gap between the wealthy and the poor is greater. I think the Western influences are greater and not in a good way.
So the Brotherhood hasn't dominated politics and more extreme?
I don't think so. I think it's more the economic divide that is very disturbing to me. And of course, there's an educational divide.
It's high unemployment there, it's something like 27%.
Yeah, I mean, you'll walk out of a mall that is immense, and just overflowing with goods. Like a mall here in the States, I think almost worse. And then you walk into the street with this kind of poverty. How do you justify that? How do they do that? The man who owned our apartment building collected his rent in US dollars, in cash, every month. But would he pay maybe an extra $10 to have somebody maybe just sweep in front of it? So, a lot of trash in the streets, and I have never been able to filter that out of my field of vision. I find it incredibly disturbing. For the poor, they can't do anything about it, but the wealthy could. They could employ these people because they are hardworking to, let's clean up our city. So there's a real sense of, and in part this is submission in terms of their beliefs, is that you just submit to whatever life you accept your lot in life. And if I had to say anything, if I were to compare how we differ, I think Christianity is a religion of hope. Whereas I feel like Islam is a religion of submission. Not that that's bad.
It's very wonderful. There's no pragmatism, not a lot of pragmatism.
So, yeah, I struggle with, it's a psychological struggle to live where there is such an incredible divide. And what is our role in it? What is our role as a foreigner who lives there? It's not fair for us to come and land and spend our time in our little gilded cage with the comforts that we had, and believe me, there were many. When they delivered our household goods, I had a man knock on my door and ask me if he could have the cardboard box that my mattress was in, because he was going to use it as a roof for his dwelling. So, and you saw this day in and day out. And like I said, at some point, you just have to put the blinders on. And there were times where I had to go up in my ivy tower and just stay there and regroup and then go back out. But I love the people, and I got love in return. And Egyptians, now I won't say this for the women because I think their lives are exceptionally hard, but the men are very, very playful in a nice way. A wonderful, wonderful sense of humor. And I loved playing with them. Now, the goat lady, she was coming down our street. I think I had like 2 weeks left in Egypt. And it was like, oh, it's now or never. I'm going to ride that donkey. This is the day. And sure enough, I stopped her and I said, get off. Put me on the donkey. Because I don't want to leave the country and not having ridden this donkey. So, and they loved that. They loved that I had a respect and the same amount of joy in the things that made them content. And that was the lesson, was how to be content. What is it that makes us content?
What about the food?
The food is, I like Egyptian food. It's kind of monotonous. It's a very limited cuisine.
A lot of rice and meat, rice and goat meat.
Middle Eastern, like kebabs.
A lot of meat.
Shawarma, a lot of chicken, scrawny chickens, a lot of rice and beans, lentils, the mesas where they do the hummus and the baba ganoush and everything. They have an incredible number of ethnic, you can eat any cuisine you want in a city like Cairo. But again, anyone, as a foreigner coming into the country, you have a salary. You can go to, of course, the real supermarkets, and you can buy recognizable food that's safe, imported foods. You can, when you want. I really tried to shop local as much as I could. I make my own tomato sauce, and I was in Cairo maybe a month, and I went down to the local market, and I told the guy I wanted 80 kilos of tomatoes. And he goes, oh, madame, you don't want 80 kilos, not 80. You mean 8 kilos? I said, no, 80. He said, no, you couldn't possibly want 80 kilos. and I wrote it down, and he said, okay. I was making tomato sauce, something he never expected a foreigner would to be doing in Egypt. But a lot of very, very fun exchanges with the people, and I did things my husband's company would not have wanted me to do. They were very cautious. We were very cautious. We were cautioned about where to go, what to do, what not to do. And
Did you have bodyguards?
No. No, I mean, it wasn't that kind of dangerous. It was, I mean, I knew Arabic, or enough Arabic, and I wasn't intimidated. But, I mean, you would do things like, I had the company, we were given a card, at least the first year when it was a temporary assignment. I would drive it down to the ancient bazaar. You know, there's no place to park, so you get down there, now what? You know, the little guy shows up and says, I'll park your car. I said, okay.
Okay, let's see it again.
I handed him the keys, that's exactly when I go, oh my God, I know I'm gonna do that in that
I
car.
bet you
What
didn't tell the mister that.
No. And, you know, I said, God, I know that course, I'll never see that car again, and I'm gonna have to, you know, fess up. It was there, exactly like he told me. So for years, his name was Yusuf. He was the one, I'd hand the keys, you know, I'll be shopping for 3 hours, be here in 3 hours with my car. No idea, no problem. Then Yusuf went back home to Upper Egypt because he was getting married. And about 9 months later, he comes back and I said, where have you been, Yusuf? He goes, oh, Madame, I got married. Now, here's an example of a language mistake and how forgiving they are. He said, oh, I got married. And I wanted to, of course, in Arabic say, how's your new bride? And I said, so I used the word agusa instead of arusa. Arusa is bride, so I had asked I thought I had asked, how is your bride? El arusa. And instead I said el arusa, which means the old hag. He never blinked an eye. He just smiled at me and said, she's right. So either she's an old hag, or he really was that forgiving and he knew what I meant to say. And so really funny things happen, as it always does. But I don't think I've ever known generous people in terms of just human, you know, exchange and a real generosity of spirit. Now, as a tourist, you're going to experience a completely different Egypt. You are going to be bombarded by, you know, the souvenir salesmen and the touts and you know, just be prepared for that. It's very hard to just leave me alone sort of thing. But that's their chance. And if you're on a cruise ship, you know, oh my gosh, you know, they've got that little window of time to sell you as many sparrows and farrows and beads and things that they can. But just, you know, if you're traveling there, be open to it. And it's an adventure. Yeah.
You mentioned that your daughter was teaching.
Uh-huh.
Is she teaching the local children or she's teaching Americans that were
Interestingly enough, she is a special needs teacher, and so is her husband. He's half Egyptian, half Scottish. And they taught in international schools in Cairo until they just couldn't do it anymore. Now, it was not only a question of living in Cairo, which is just not pleasant, really. I mean, it's difficult. But their hands were tied as teachers because these were international schools. So hence you were dealing with the upper class Egyptians who traditionally didn't do much for their children if they had special needs. They were either kind of hidden away or they just wanted you to socially promote them. It didn't matter whether you were making any inroads into their development or whatnot. And this was very frustrating to them. Because they would actually, you know, if they'd had a parent-teacher meeting, they would, you know, want to bribe them, the teachers, or they were allowed to talk at all to the parents, you know, so that none of this kind of negotiation would take place. So they eventually said, that's it, we're moving to the South Sinai, and they built a home there. And they taught in they were very, very small. I mean, you can imagine, it's a small, it's a little resort town. It is on the Red Sea. But international. Okay, they were teaching internationally still. And then after about 2 years of that, they shifted into private teaching. So.
But this is in English, it's not in
Yes, yeah. Well, for my daughter, it's in English. Rest of her students are Russian, German, maybe Brits, mostly Russian and German. And then my son-in-law will teach, of course, local children. as well as in Arabic, as well as foreigners. So what they do is they fill a niche for families who live in the country as expats, who have children who need to meet the requirements of their home country to prepare for exams. And so they'll teach whatever subject it is that's needed. And they have adopted very much a very minimalist lifestyle because they're content. You know, when she moved to Sinai, from Cairo, and was giving up, you know, a real teaching job, let's say, I said to her, I said, Bernadette, I said, you can't do this, you're a teacher, you know. Teachers teach. And she looked at me and she said, I don't need to be in a classroom to teach, Mom. And that was her response. And she has, besides her paying students, she has had a slew of veteran children, right? They arrive in her garden barefoot, and she teaches them. And she takes them to the sea, and she says, and one of the funny stories was all the little boys, and these would have been like probably elementary school, maybe middle school age, but the village medicine man, I don't know what the real term is, came through and they were circumcised, you know. And so they came to my daughter, they were so proud. these little necklaces with, you know,
Foreskins.
the foreskin in a little pouch. Not only that, they were dropping their drawers to show my daughter their necklace. And, you know, by the end of the week, she said, you know, I've seen enough of your little wellies, you know, you do not need to show this to me anymore. But the doctor had said that they needed to spend time in the sea to help heal. So she took them to the sea every single day. And what I loved watching with my daughter is, particularly with the young girls that come, you know, it's more girls than boys that come to her, that she doesn't teach them to want Western things or Western way. She respects where they are and supports what it is that fulfills them, you know, and yes, does encourage them to want to be educated for sure and to pursue that if that's their desire, but she doesn't make that her place. You know, that's not my role. And so she has a beautiful relationship with these children. And they married very young too. Because I always forget and say, I don't see so much. She's mom, they married, you know, 17, 18, they're married. So she has a window of time with young girls to impart values, but within the social and religious culture that they live in.
Do they have internet there?
Oh, yeah. The first year they were in the Sinai, my daughter was actually teaching online a graduate class at the University of Texas. And it just blew my mind because she's teaching, you know, a class and her neighbor's riding a camel. You know?
That's wonderful. They're all there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,